I mean, I know that part of where you see us needing to go has to do with, I can't remember quite how you call it, distributive cognition.
Yeah.
And I can see how this deep sharedness and this kind of deep investment in communities, plural, and the conscious linking of them, that has an antidotal, not an anecdotal, but an antidote quality to what it is that we're speaking about, this source of the meaning crisis.
Yeah, yeah. So the thing that came there was a distinction that I learned in the context of my friends from the integral community,
Uh-huh.
Which is not historically been my community. I suppose I have a lot of friends from that community, so maybe it is now.
Mm.
The distinction between, or you even use the term like autonomy and communion.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the gift, the thing that we are moving into, is this gift where community
Mm-hmm.
is not only no longer, or is not only not antithetical to our individuation, but is in fact generative of it,
Mm-hmm.
and generated by it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it is the communion of communion with individuation. It is the dynamic, the realization that there is a particular location, particular kind of community. So it's not all communities, but a particular kind of community that constitutes, in many ways its essence is that it constitutes whole, well-individuated people, selves. But because they are whole, well-individuated selves, they themselves, by choice, right, through consent and conscious consent, or constitute a community, this particular kind of community. You can imagine that if you've got that kind of a feedback loop going, this is a enduring community, right? The people it produce it, but the people it produces do not become lesser by virtue of being part of it. Right? They don't lose their individuation. They don't become homogenous. They become increasingly singular, but they do not become atomized by virtue of their becoming singular. In fact, they become even more drawn to consensual community. Right? And so it's both maintains its integrity as a whole, but it also is evolving and expanding in the nature of what it is. Right? Its own interior continues to grow while maintaining its continuity as a whole. And that is another way of saying game B. Right? That's the thing. Right? That is the antidote. That is the move that goes on, that's on the other side of the devil's bargain. Right? It's the different kind of game that we can play. And so some interesting things about it that I've been noticing or discovering, or how does John talk about it? Imagio. That is this word that means both to discover and to invent simultaneously. Recently I think it's proper and certainly helpful to be thinking about this new game in a fashion that's somewhat simple, meaning that from one point of view, it's just a special case of culture in general. It's just a special case of the kind of games that we play. Yeah, can I drill down on that a little bit? Here I want to invoke another friend of mine, Greg Henricks, who I've been just speaking to recently, who has a model he calls TALK, the theory of knowledge. He uses all kinds of obviously Gen X acronyms to describe what he's doing. And so what he talks about in the theory of knowledge is he very specifically has a description of what's happening and why we see these moments of emergence.
Mm-hmm.
So the transition
Moments of
from
emergence in history or
in history,
Mm-hmm.
in history. So, and I'll provide more detail. So the movement from, say, physics to chemistry,
Mm-hmm.
from chemistry to biology,
Mm-hmm.
from to genetics and evolving organisms. In the context of biology, the emergence of behavior, and, intelligence, biological organisms that are doing things on the basis of, in fact, neurology, sensing. From behavior, then the emergence of culture, right? And then from culture, the emergence of this next thing. Right? So we actually find ourselves having conversations about, okay, what's this next thing? We're in culture. We can now describe what this thing is and where it comes from and how it sets up and what came before it and what these kind of transitions look like in general. What's this transition that we're at? What's it look like? And one of the interesting characteristics of it is that each of the transitions looks like a particular location on the previous landscape. And so neurology is just a kind of cell. You've got all these different kinds of cells and they all do different kinds of things. One of them is a neuron. And from the point of view of like cellular, it's not that sexy. It just turns out that once you've discovered a neuron, you may not have noticed it yet. You're now actually beginning to play a very different kind of thing, because you can begin to coordinate neurons into larger and larger structures. They have that characteristic that they can connect with each other and form neural pathways, and they can specialize. That different kinds of neurons can specialize in different ways. And now what happens is that neurons generate the possibility of different reactions, different regular reactions to discrete inputs. And that's what a neuron is, right? Like a photosensitive cell has the ability to distinguish between enough light to be able to say yes, no to light, and then drive different behaviors, right? And that's how behavior emerges. And behavior emerges as a consequence of the discovery of this particular thing, this particular kind of cell that has the characteristics of neuron. And then sociality, culture, emerges in the context of behavior. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens in behavior space. Sorry, I think I got a little bit esoteric and maybe a little bit nerdy, but the point is that there's a way of properly looking at the transition that we're at, where you're going to look at the kind of culture that escapes or is the antidote. And in many ways, it's just going to look like a culture. I'm like, okay, got it. Why is it special? Oh, okay. Well, we're going to that the specialness is emergent. It's the emergence that it affords. And then, by the way, it's also the regularity that it affords, right? The stability that it affords.
You mean the human stability, like the stability in terms of taking care of people? You mean at a fundamental level?
Yeah, in some sense. But maybe be a bit more clear. And by clear, I actually mean literally inventing the answer to your question on the fly. What I mean is the simplification of the choice landscape such that the simplification is consistently chosen. That's not a very clear statement, is it? Let me say it again a different way. Well, I described it earlier with a slightly different form, which was like we have a kind of culture. I described it as a community. So we have a kind of community. And this community has a very interesting character, which is that it produces people who, and maybe if I zoom in on the stability, it produces people who are in fact well individuated. So they don't have to have an adolescent break. Right? They don't have to, in fact, will not choose to try to destroy or break or fight against their culture, Instead, they will be able to be, they will find themselves supported in discovering the nature of their individuation by virtue. They'll be well held. Right? So care, right? This culture holds the developmental process elegantly so that we don't find ourselves fighting against and breaking and rebelling against. We don't need to. Rebelling is actually not a natural process. Rebelling is an unnatural but necessary reaction to something that is not supported well. And also, these well-individuated people will, like I said it earlier, they will choose. They will consistently, but choose. Right? Think about the really interesting characteristic there. They will consistently choose to recreate or to generate amongst themselves this particular kind of community. That is stable. Right? All the things that have historically caused our civilizations to fall apart, of which there are three exact kinds. There are three kinds of things that cause them to fall apart. All three are resolved.
Say the three really quickly.
Sure. So one has to do with the relationship between our civilization and nature.
Yeah.
Desertification.
Right.
We trade the long term for the short term until the long term comes to pass and we're fucked. The second has to do with this hierarchy of domination. We have an interior, but in our interior, we are actually sowing the seeds of an inevitable conflict. There's always going to be the struggle to figure out who's on top. And as soon as a crack opens, war on the interior happens. And the third is the same thing on the exterior. The exterior is the relationship with the other on the outside. And if my, Rome, if I do not maintain my borders at a high enough level, in maintaining my borders at a high enough level, I'm simultaneously generating resentment and antipathy on the other side of the border and teaching them how to get better and better and better at playing the devil's game until eventually they burst, right? So either humiliated individuals on the interior destroy the civilization from its inside. And by the way, these humiliated individuals are not necessarily the lower class. Right? The increasingly drug-addled and ennui-ridden and disconnected
President of the United States
are humiliated just in a very different fashion. Right? We'll call it debased. The debased and humiliated, just so we can kind of distinguish it, corrupt it or tear apart that from the interior. Or guys on the outside eventually figure out how to break through. Or worst case, or sort of last checksum, we've just destroyed the actual nature and it collapses.
And can't support it. Yeah.
All three. Yeah.
But for this culture to work and thrive, we're talking about a very high level of human development, a high level of self-awareness.
Oh yes.
Yeah, we're talking about,
but not fictional, right? Not like, well, we're going to become just like these imaginary beings that don't actually ever exist, and then it'll be okay. It's more like, well, we'll actually get to a place where we're all roughly the same level of maturity and self-awareness and self-management as, say, the citizens of Tahiti before Cook landed. Or have you ever noticed a person who just was really very grounded and wise and seemed to be good at managing their lives without creating too much havoc in other people's lives? Like that. Most people, just like most people, will be more better. Like it's not, we don't have to get to a point where everybody's awesome or even perfect, but most people are more better. And then once you get past that tipping point, by the way, it happens again in the sense of sort of everywhere. So it happens at the level of the interior, so the human, or the interior of the human or the individual. So the human beings, the individual human beings, are healed, made more whole, but also in the relationships. And so the modes and means and mechanisms of how we're able to work together to support each other, to co-steward nature and to support the commonwealth are also healed, right? It's a different means and modes of relationship. And this can be, it's a lot. There's a lot of things to be talked about here, but let me just give an example of a very simple one. Just say conversation. You and I are having a conversation. In this conversation, there are in fact a very large number of implicit protocols that are guiding our conversation. For example, as far as I can tell, neither of us is either consciously or meaningfully unconsciously endeavoring to lie. And in fact, my basic sense is I'm simply striving to achieve a higher level of clarity in what it is that we're communicating. That's it. Like signal to noise ratio, maximize signal, minimize noise. It's sort of a very simple protocol. Now you might notice, however, that is not a protocol that actually governs the relationships of communication in many, in fact, one might even say almost all communications. If you take a look at the landscape that we find ourselves in, our social, our linguistic, communicative commons has been enormously degraded. The commitment to caring for that commons thoughtfully, noting that, for example, achieving higher levels of clarity is both process and result, has been ravaged over the past 50 to 75 years. I actually remember the moment as a child. I was probably like 4 or 5 when I discovered that I lived in a culture where it was not just appropriate, but apparently ubiquitous and obligatory to lie to children in a sophisticated way. It was in fact a McDonald's Happy Meal commercial. So I was watching this box that clearly had cultural support, meaning my parents put me in front of the box and turned it on. And in the box, there was music that caused my body to feel a felt sense of enthusiasm. Colors that made my visual sense feel a sense of enthusiasm. And it was bound to an object that was a bag full of food that was called a Happy Meal. And my semantic processor was like, happy. Yeah, that also maps. So I feel good. It looks good. It sounds good. It must be awesome. Yeah. So I cajole my parents, let's get me a Happy Meal, right? This culture is amazing, right? I go to McDonald's. So far, so good, by the way. Everything's yellow and plastic and, day glow. I'm not yet noticing that the plastic has a weird felt sense of already being dead. Like I didn't realize it was in a mausoleum just yet. I get the bag. It looks like the one on TV. So far, so good. I open it up. I take out the hamburger. I remember actually at that point having my first whiff of like, something's wrong here. I ate about 1/3 of it. And I had a deep existential crisis as a 4-year-old. I am not happy. This thing does not even vaguely feel like the feeling that I associated with it in that television program. And all at once it dawned on me that I lived in a culture where it was permitted, obviously not at this level of linguistic complexity, but I remember the moment. Where it was permitted and in fact apparently obligatory and ubiquitous to lie to children effectively.
Wow.
How fucked up is that? Like, that's insane. It's not even borderline insane. It's completely insane. And yet, look around. All right. So the point is this. It's not actually that hard to not be completely fucking insane.